Welcome to this course on personalized medicine. Personalized medicine is getting a lot of press, and people are very interested in the idea that their medicine should be personalized. But in fact, the idea that we take care of patients in a very highly individualized way is not something new. Hippocrates, the father of modern and ancient medicine, said, "It is more important to know what sort of person has a disease than to know what sort of a disease a person has." That's another way of saying that it's important to understand the patient, and then you'll understand the disease. More recently, Sir William Osler, the father of modern medicine, a Canadian who went to Johns Hopkins to found the famous Department of Medicine there and ended out his career at Oxford, is widely quoted. I'll just read you the bottom quote. You can read the top one to yourself. "The good physician treats the disease. The great physician treats the patient who has the disease." That's another way of saying that the great physician understands what it is about their patient that's special, that's individual, that's unique, and tries to tailor the therapy for them. So those ideas have been around for a long time. So the question is, what is so special about this vogue for personalized medicine? So we've known forever that occasional patients seem different from the average somehow. How long they live, how susceptible or resistant they are to disease, how well they'll respond to drugs, or how badly they'll respond to certain drugs. The excitement in personalized medicine is that we now have new tools with which to understand this variability and to exploit it. So one of the new tools is an understanding of the DNA molecule, and we'll talk about that in the next few modules. But it's important to understand that without the advent of modern computer technology, we would not be able to analyze the DNA sequences that we have and understand how it is that those should be applied to individual patients. So I think that the revolution in personalized medicine is taking advantage of these two developments, one in the science of DNA and the other in the science of managing large data sets. So large data sets are not just DNA, but other kinds of data sets. What you surf at Google, what your x-rays look like, what your shopping habits are like, and taken together, that is defining the new science of big data. And big data is another way of looking at very, very large data sets and trying to understand what it is about an individual person, a patient, or a shopper that makes them different. We're all familiar with that from surfing the web, and you can imagine that you could surf your DNA web and do the same kind of individualization. Okay, so the promise of this personalized medicine, big data intersection is that we will learn more about disease susceptibility or response to drugs by looking at DNA patterns, by looking at patterns in electronic medical records, by looking at patterns of proteins that we can measure in blood samples, by looking at other kinds of large data sets to understand what it is that makes an individual special. And one of the things that we're going to use that for is to engage patients in their own care, in their individualization. Now, the problem there is that patients vary in their level of excitement around the concepts of personalized medicine. So people vary for many, many reasons that have very little to do with their health, their biological health, but have everything to do with their environment, the way they were brought up, their educational levels. People vary in their religious beliefs. Some people really believe very, very deeply that certain forms of treatment should never be applied. Other people are willing to apply other kinds of other forms of therapy. So the way you're brought up makes a difference in your attitude toward this new science of personalized medicine. The level of education makes a big difference. I show here a picture of a food label. Now, some people can look at that food label and grasp immediately the important information that they need for their own care. Other people can't read, so those food labels are not very useful to them. Many patients take more than one medicine. Here's a picture of a patient with many, many, many pill bottles. So some patients can handle taking 20 medicines. Other patients just don't have the intellectual or the financial capacity to take 20 different medicines, all of them on different schedules, all of them with the potential of interacting with each other. So we have to individualize at the level of understanding these kinds of factors. And of course, the other factor that is making a huge difference is the level at which people have access to electronic media. Increasingly, we're seeing patients communicating with their doctors through the computer. We're seeing patients communicating, downloading information from the web, whether it's good or bad. And some patients have access to that information, other patients don't. So that creates another opportunity for individualizing care based on what a patient can and wants to do. And so those are important pieces of the individualization or personalization puzzle. So my basic philosophy in designing this course has been to illustrate the potential of personalized medicine using a case-based approach. We'll talk about individual clinical cases and how personalizing through genetics or other mechanisms can result potentially in improved care. The first few modules are going to deal with some principles in genetics and principles in drug therapy. Some of that will be elementary for those of you who have been to medical school, and I ask your indulgence. The goal is to get everyone up to speed so we can use common terminology and common concepts when it comes time to approach the cases. And after the cases, we'll have a couple of modules on exactly how personalized medicine is being rolled out in healthcare systems, thinking about the ethical issues a little bit, thinking about the issues around extensive, large, personalized databases, extensive, large electronic medical records, and some of the obstacles that people are encountering when they're implementing those systems, and some of the potential solutions. So I thought I would start a little bit in this module with some very, very basic principles in genetics and mostly history. So we've known for a long time, actually since the middle of the 1700s, that individuals vary in their fingerprints. Everybody has a unique fingerprint. That was actually discovered by a Czech physiologist named Purkinje, whose picture is shown here. And he came from this small Central European republic, which is now the Czech Republic. He came from near Prague. And that'll become important in a second. Now, this picture shows two young men. They are, in fact, not the same person, but they look very much the same. And this illustrates the idea that genetic information or information on how you look and how you respond to your environment is transmitted across generations. And how is it that we transmit information from a parent to a child? The one in the striped pajamas is the son. The one in the blue and red sweater is the father. So this is why the Czech Republic is important, because in the 19th century, a monk working in the Czech Republic in Moravia, the monk's name was Gregor Mendel, developed the rules around which we understand genetic information is passed from one generation to another. Mendel's basic experiment was to breed peas together. So he would take peas, and he would look at the characteristics of the peas. Now, the word we use to describe the characteristic is the phenotype. So the phenotype that he was looking at was whether the peas are smooth or wrinkly. And he would mate smooth peas and wrinkly peas. And in the next generation, he would look and all the peas were smooth. And then he would mate the smooth peas with each other. And out of every 4 pea plants, 3 of them would generate smooth peas, and 1 of them would generate crinkly peas. And he did this experiment over and over and over again, hundreds of times, in fact, thousands of times, and developed rules that we now use to understand the way in which genetic information is transmitted from one generation to another. And we'll go over those in a subsequent module. So the next great advance in our understanding of the way information is transmitted from one generation to the next occurred in the early 1950s when these two young scientists, Crick and Watson, described the structure of a molecule they were studying. The name of the molecule is DNA. They published their article describing the structure of DNA in a single page in the journal Nature, and arguably won the Nobel Prize for that single publication. Here's a picture of that particular publication, and what's interesting is that the cartoon drawing of the structure of DNA was actually drawn by Francis Crick's wife. There are 2 quotes that I think are really interesting in this article. One of the quotes is the very first sentence. The very first sentence says, "We wish to suggest a structure for the salt of DNA. The structure has novel features which are of considerable biological interest." So these guys are structural biologists, and they're studying this large molecule, and they know that it has something to do with heredity. But they actually, the way in which heredity works, the way in which information is transmitted from generation to generation is not known. And they solve the structure of DNA, and they look at the structure and they say, oh, wait a second, now we understand how information might get transmitted from one generation to the next. So from structure, they infer function, and from function, they infer mechanisms for heredity. The other sentence that is fabulous in this article is the last sentence of the science. And the last sentence is a real example of understatement. It says, "It has not escaped our notice that the specific pairing we have postulated immediately suggests a possible copying mechanism for the genetic material." So the problem is, how does anything transmit from one generation to the next? If it does that, there has to be a mechanism for the molecules to copy themselves. So here's the idea. This is the DNA molecule that we're all familiar with. Everybody likes to focus on the sides of the ladder, the double helix, the double helices. But what's really interesting and what's the workhorse in this molecule is actually the little rungs of the ladder that are connecting those two double helices. And the way it works is that there are 4 components to those rungs of the ladder. We abbreviate them A, C, T, and G. C and G always talk to each other, and A and T always talk to each other. So when there's a T on one strand, there will be an A on the other strand. That's called base pairing. And the things that hold those 2 base pairs together are indicated in this cartoon by dots. Those dots indicate a chemical bond, but it's not a very strong chemical bond. So what Crick and Watson recognized is that it's not a strong chemical bond, and that means it could fall apart. And if it falls apart, the molecule starts to unwind, and then each side becomes a template for creating daughter strands. So they look at this structure and they say, oh, isn't that interesting? If this happens, then each daughter strand can copy itself, and we have a mechanism by which information might be transmitted from one generation to the next. We'll talk more about that in subsequent modules.